Hey there, my friends. So, flatbeds, are they crushed? Are they stopped? Is it flat? Well, it is a flatbed.
Yeah.
Hey there, my friends. Hey, you like that little joke, Dean?
Yeah.
that was the best I can come up with at the
Yeah.
drop of a dime this early in the morning. But flatbeds, my man. So, welcome everybody back to Data Day. As we progress into the end of Q1, cannot believe we've got like 34 days left until the end of Q1. Is absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
We're looking at getting some new I'm going to call it new vibrations, new vibes into the logistics life this year. And I got some really big plans for the upcoming month and the rest of the year for us. And it's starting today.
Yeah.
With this flatbed market. So obviously we have, at this point in time, y'all know, unless you're living under a rock, we've got, looming tariffs. We've got this happening. We've got that happening. We've got aluminum. We got steel. We got all these talks. We got Canada being the 51st state. And we got Canada beating the US in the Four Nations hockey.
Yeah.
Yeah, baby. Wow. So we have a gentleman at the office that is American, and he bet a bunch of people lunch. And I came into the office the other day, Dean, and I go, dude, you don't bet against Canada in hockey. And it's kind of one of these things because it's a rolling joke for us. But it's one of these things that sometimes I'm right and sometimes I'm very wrong.
Right.
And I guess that's typically like most of life with me. But that all that aside, Dean, what are we seeing in the flatbed market? And actually, and I'm sorry, I know I'm jumping here this morning, but before we go there, I can share with the audience this. I've been on DAT's data network, if you will, for about 2 weeks now. And Dean, I had no idea what I was missing. I mean, I thought, you and I having conversations for 3 years now, understanding data, but what RateView and the DAT IQ technology gives people, I have to tell you, is second to none, my man.
Yeah.
So congratulations to all of you at DAT. With every software, there are challenges that come up all the time, and I get it. And there were some issues back in 2024. I'm not even going there. What I'm talking about is if you are looking, for all of you watching and listening, if you are looking for the premier tool to get data, you got to get on the IQ software. I'm blown away, Dean, and I can't wait for you to show me around on it because I think you're the top-notch gear expert on it. Well, you are the data man. And I'm telling you, wow. Like,
it's interesting, Dan. It's a really interesting take on it from someone, just having a deep dive into it. There's even a bigger deep dive you could have into some of the derivatives that are sitting behind the MCI RateView, because a lot of folks take all of that raw data and build their own products around it. So it's not just, what's the rate been over the last 12 months or what's Ratecast forecasting for the next 52 weeks. There's a whole lot of rich data that sits behind that people use to ingest and build their own models around their own custom business. It's a really interesting snapshot of the market. So I think for brokers, it's a great starting point, right? It's like, what's the rate been? What are carriers getting paid? I think the big distinction is it's based on loads moved, right? So it's not based on what was the rate per mile of the load that was posted by the broker. It's based on what the carrier accepted the load at. So, and of course, a lot of folks will say, well, that's just big carriers or it's just small fleets. Well, if you're a small carrier and you've worked for, Dan Deegan, at some point in time, you're a one truck operator, your rate is in the mix. And it's a really good average. And I think that's where a lot of folks get caught up in, that's you're manipulating the rate because of the size of the business. No, we're not manipulating the rate. The rate is an average of what carriers haul loads for on a given lane over a given time frame. And it's really just a starting point for that all critical negotiation. So on both sides of the transaction, the buy and the sell.
So I can tell you, because I was, I'm not going to say skeptical, but I wanted to validate, I guess would be a better word. So what I did, Dean, is I ran, we have a customer that we're looking at expanding our business with.
Yep.
So they sent us out about, 60 of their lanes.
Yep.
And so what I did is I put it in the multi-lane tool. A team member of mine, Linda, got me back the information. So I looked at it and I said, okay, before I do anything, I want to validate it. So what I did is I chose every fourth lane.
Right.
And that it did a deep dive in the fourth lane. And I'll tell you, upwards of 97%.
Right.
Bang on, like
yep.
bang on to the penny
yep.
of what we did. And what I did is I took lanes that we already did, that we already have data on in our system.
Right.
And I just started plugging and playing and looking at the data. And originally it was because the one funny thing, and I'll get to this before we get into flatbeds, was I didn't like, so I was doing US, Canada, US, and inter US.
Right.
And so like I wanted to make sure I had all three spectrums of the rate we move.
Right.
And I was looking at it, and at one point it was like 98 cents a mile. And I'm like, who the hell did, forgetting it was in US funds. So I have to do 135 exchange and then add fuel. Right. And I was like, who's running freight at 98 cents a mile? And I'm thinking, but then when I do the exchange and add the fuel, I'm like, oh, it's bang on. So it was amazing. And that tool alone has increased our velocity by about 35%.
Huh, that's interesting.
Like it's the metrics.
Yeah. When
a team uses it right.
Yeah.
The ability to get that information back so fast.
Right.
Even to the point where we're now using it on our sales calls. So I'll be talking to a prospect and they'll be saying, well, I do this, this, and this, and I'll quietly be typing in the background. And I can instantly, with authority, say, okay, so I can't meet that price.
Right.
Like, there's no way I can meet that price. Or you know what, you're right in the market specs. I think I can meet the price. Let's talk about some of the challenges we might be able to help you overcome.
That's good.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
it tells you where the market's at, right? It's like, it's kind of, it's like we say to carriers, right? You've got to know your operating costs. Well, if you're going to negotiate and buy volume, you've got to know what's your starting point. And that's very astute of you to know whether you're in the ballpark or not, because a lot of sales folks would spin their wheels trying to get that call, not realizing they have very little chance of winning that business because there's a peculiarity around the incumbent carrier that allows them to do it for that rate. And it's almost always going to be they've got a better rate coming into that town than anyone else because of some homegrown contract freight they've got. It always allows them to negotiate differently on the backhaul.
Well, I remember when I was with Transcend, we were doing Dell Computer from Austin and Nashville, right? And our entire fleet was team drivers. At our peak, we were about 110 trucks, but our entire fleet was team drivers. Probably around the 110, I think. And our specialty was that Austin, Texas triangle and Nashville triangle. And that was, the triangle was, back to Ontario or to Calgary. And that triangle, we were almost unbeatable in.
Right.
And what I mean by that is, and this was in no which way, shape, or form us trying to, destroy what at that time we called outbound rates.
Right.
But what the money we were getting from Dell, because it was multi-million-dollar loads, team drivers, time, like we literally had a clock. The second you left, it went and it starts ticking, and you better be in the sorting facility at UPS or FedEx out west in a certain amount of time, or else. And it was interesting because this is back when very few people ordered online. It wasn't like today. Like for all of you watching and listening, we're going back to 2000, 2001 kind of area. So, I mean, Dell only sold online, but what they realized, and their data told them quickly, if they didn't have it in a sorting facility and out to the customer in X amount of time, they would refund.
Right.
Because at that point, it wasn't like we are today, right?
Right.
You buy something online, it doesn't show up for 2 weeks. You don't even, most of the time, you don't even think about it. You're like, oh, it's coming from Asia or whatever it is.
Right.
It is what it is. Now, we're getting a little different than that because of the Amazon next day stuff. But so what would happen is we would get a lot of money coming inbound. So because of that, we were able to go south for like 90 cents a mile, all in.
Yeah.
And still make a lot of money.
Right.
But we took risks. We had lost, like, there's risk versus reward, right? But, and this is what I'm finding with the IQ system,
right? Is
we're speaking with prospects and they're saying, oh, I'm running that at $1,500. And I'm looking at IQ and it's like $2,000.
Right.
And it's one of these things that just had the conversation with one of my sales reps yesterday. And he goes, well, we need to be, they need to be at 37. I said, well, the going rate's 45. I said, so I'm not even interested in like speaking about that lane. Let's move on.
Right.
And so we moved on to other lanes, left that one alone and just told the prospect, listen, we just can't, like, that rate that you're getting is probably why you're having so many service failures.
Right.
Right. And you can almost allocate, or you can almost connect those rates to the issues they're having.
Yeah.
Right. And so I just wanted to say that to you because I'm so impressed with the system. And a shout out to Malcolm from DAT. He has been awesome in helping us get this all organized and arranged.
Good.
So I wanted to share that.
Yeah.
With
and it's for a company that's been around since 1978, we talk about in our marketing package $1 trillion worth of data. That's a lot of freight transactions to learn from. So I was kind of amazed during the pandemic that our rate forecasting was so accurate seasonally. Like, so you think about seasonality, it kind of disappeared. And then we were looking for signals. Where's the market going? You remember you were on the show talking about, we have no idea where the market's going because it was all uncharted territory. Our rate forecast, when we produce what we call our corn cob, which is our plot of where rates are forecast to be 14 days out, like it's got a mean average error of about 5%. So that means it's like 95% accurate. If I said to you, this is what the rate's going to be on a given lane out 14 days, it's like 95% accurate all of the time. But it was like that during the pandemic. So it's always fascinating to me how much freight moves in the same sort of way in the US, and there's almost a predictability to it. There's a little bit of movement, but when you look at data over the long arc of time, there's a lot of patterns in there, and it takes a lot of data and computing horsepower to see it, which is probably a good segue to flatbed, because flatbed is anything but flat. And one of the things I've been watching, how consistently flatbed rates have been. And so this is, even though it's a play on words, I went back and looked at the average flatbed rate excluding fuel for 2.5 years, and it was at $2 a mile. Like, Dan, it hadn't moved much over that period of time, and it was kind of fascinating to me how consistent it was. But of course, we get to winter, and this is why flatbed's the only bright note on the horizon right now. And I think this speaks to market equilibrium, because when you're at market equilibrium where supply and demand is trying to find its level, what happens is any change in volume overwhelms that supply, which has been exiting, right? So, past tense exiting, still exiting. When you get a surge in volume, rates go up. So think polar vortex, brake check week, road check week. Anytime hurricanes, anytime you get a surge or an imbalance in volume, you get lanes moving. We saw it last week with all of the flooding down, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia in flatbed. I talked to brokers last week, and they were having a lot of trouble trying to find trucks to run south out of Memphis. I mean, outbound loads moved are up about 25% year over year out of there. Load posts are up 21% last week. The reason, Dan, is whenever you get any weather along I-40 heading west into Memphis, suddenly capacity starts to dry up. And I think that was a good example to me of how tight capacity is in flatbed. So it didn't take much. It took a bit of flooding, and then suddenly there was tight capacity on certain lanes. So what we're seeing now is the spring replenishment season effect. which is that early seasonality that we see when temperatures warm up. Now, it's anything but warm where you and I live. But if you think back to last year, when you and I were talking in the middle of February last year, it was much warmer. You weren't snowmobiling, if I remember, snowmobiling. And what I remember talking to you about it, and I said, Dan, it's February the 15th, I think it was, and there are flatbeds bringing garden mulch out of northern Maine in the middle of February, and it was extraordinary. I haven't seen that yet, but because the Lowe's and Home Depot's parking lots are full of snow and ice still. Right? So, but what you see in other parts of the country are when we're heading into planting season, construction season, nursery season, replenishment of spring inventories ahead of you and I buying stuff to do our spring gardening. So all of that starts to move, and a lot of it on flatbeds, because you start to get a lot of lumber being repositioned in the markets. So whenever you start to see that, what we see in flatbed is rates start to go up from early. It's kind of counterintuitive because flatbed is a pretty hard equipment type in winter, but rates start to go up when you get into that January period all the way through to June. And they're doing that right now. And rates are forecast to go up another 8 cents a mile between now and the end of March, which is fairly significant. Then they'll be about 8 cents a mile higher than last year by the end of March, but they'll be about 8 cents a mile lower than 2023. Right. So we're still not blowing the doors off the market in terms of where the market's going, but flatbed is the market that's growing while dry van and reefer are kind of shrinking. Those markets are still going down. And I think flatbed is such a market that is hinged to industrial production. I think that's the thing that most of us are worried about is the industrial production side, because we're just not seeing any data points there to say that the market is improving from the overall market perspective. But flatbed is, I think, we're at a point where capacity is fairly tight. I don't see any other change in direction absent demand destruction, which is a distinct possibility because your tariffs are about to come in next week. March the 1st, I think, is the tariffs on Mexico and Canada. The president said last night they're going to go ahead. So what we're seeing is a market that, and John Kingston wrote about this really well. He was talking about the oil market last night, and he said that oil is showing signs of disorientation in the face of the sheer volume of new policy stances, and faced with the realization that a single social media post could move the market significantly in any direction. Yes. So I think what you're seeing is this kind of malaise in the market. And that's why at some point this becomes a pretty big deal for the broader market. But right now, flatbed is showing strength in the market. And I think that's good news for flatbed carriers. It's not so good for dry van and reefer carriers right now because they're in the downside of the seasonality curve. When you look at rates, they typically drop between now and March, early April. And you don't start to see those two sectors pick up, particularly reefer, until you get produce season starting to move significant volume. So again, seasonality is evident. Flatbed is moving up. We had some weather impact regional rates last week in the Memphis area, but nothing to say the market is behaving in a way where the economy is booming, right? There's no data point that says that we're going to have a fairly sustained period of demand. I think it's just more seasonality, Dan, where you're starting to see some of that freight volume move against the backdrop of a lot of carriers have exited the market. And
Dean, I've got a couple of questions because, I look at these two markets and I look at the flatbed market in a much different manner than dry van and reefer for that matter. And I'm wondering, obviously we know we have like hundreds of thousands of carriers coming in the last couple of years, or thousands of carriers coming in the last couple of years, mainly in the dry van and reefer market, right? Do you think, or what's your perspective on the fact that flatbeds have kind of remained consistent? They move up and down slightly, but they've remained consistent pretty much since 2018. Is it because, or do you think it's more along the lines of, it's a pretty strict or heavily labored market, right? Flatbed, you got a tarp, the strapping, all of that
specialized
stuff. Specialized. I can't believe I didn't even think of that word. So very specialized market. You have to have certain drivers. There's way more complexity in flatbed than anything, especially when you get into the double drop or single drop extendable goose, like all this kind of stuff. And from a point where I look at it and I say, you know, I can go buy a couple of dry vans, hire a driver. They don't even have to be that great at driving, and I can make money. Right. Call a spade, right?
So flatbed is highly specialized, and don't forget, currently 32% of all flatbed loads move on spot. But so it's a big spot market because, to your point, it's specialized. There's a lot of one-off project type work, right? So it's not like you're running Atlanta, Dallas, and back, you know, 1,000 times a week. There's a lot of freight that moves into areas where they're building a new warehouse or a new construction site or a new AI data center.
3 months, and then it'll move to another area. So
you don't have that rate, might not have been an RFP the prior year. So for the carrier, they've also got more deadhead miles out of that area to another market to reload. So that's why you see a lot more load posts for brokers trying to, you know, look for carriers in bigger geographic areas. So higher volume, but highly specialized, Dan. It's very difficult to be a flatbed carrier and be successful at it. And I think that's why it's a natural barrier to entry to that capacity, where it's very easy to buy a used truck and rent a trailer and go and haul freight. And it's very hard to differentiate yourself in the dry van market. Like, how do you do that? Whereas in flatbed, a lot of it's got to do with your equipment, your dunnage, your tarps, your chains, your packing, your carpet, right? To protect the corners of your tarps from steel. There's, coil racks. Like you go to the drop deck carriers. Do you have a ramp to take a Humvee up on the second level of the trailer? Do you have ramps at the back to drive equipment on? Some guys have got 4 8-foot ramps underneath their trailer that allows a 16-foot ramp at the back to drive vehicles up on if they've got the low profile tires. So when you get into that market, you get into highly specialized equipment types. And of course, in our world, a drop deck could also be a flatbed. You know, there's different types of flatbeds, as you well know, but we're about to come out with individual equipment types that are more specific, breaking down the flatbed into different segments, which will be really, really good news. So it's highly specialized.
Trailer or something like that, where it's very highly specialized. So I think it's a harder market for carriers. There's more barriers to entry. People a higher dollar value to entry on the trailers and
people that aren't serious about the industry. It's a much harder industry to get into and stick at. Just having been involved in flatbeds all of my life, it's a tough market sector. So that's why I think we're seeing when demand goes up, rates are going up. It's a bigger spot market play. There's fewer carriers to choose from. So I think that's where you're going to see pockets of the market where capacity's tight. And we had on our show this week, we had Cody Kaler from ANZ talking about the produce market. They have very particular carriers they use for cherries and peaches and high value. Like, they have very unique carriers with a certain equipment type. Like a reefer's not a reefer's not a reefer. They have very particular carriers, and that's why the rates are high for certain commodity types. Because I think when you get into really specialized types of freight, you're going to see capacity tightness because of the natural barriers to entry, because of the cost of equipment.
I even see a difference in dry van carriers in that respect too.
Yeah.
So like when you're hauling food grade product, I think anyone watching this show, listening to this show, wherever you're consuming this, if you haul any food grade product that like has to be clean, free of odor and all that kind of stuff, you've ran into issues just hiring a carrier because they have a trailer and because they have a truck available. And you've come into major, I know I did. I mean, I remember when I was dealing with Univar, I had a carrier that was a great carrier. They never did me wrong. I put them on the Univar account, and within a week I lost the account. Because they could not adapt to the needs of the customer. And I mean, it was, my bad because I didn't pull the plug earlier, but it was one of these things where I'm having conversations with guys, like, we can't show up. No, I promise it's going to, but it's just like, I mean, even one point there was a cluster fly nest that they didn't identify, close the doors, open up at the shipper, they open the doors and like thousands of flies come, and I'm like, well, how did they get, you go, oh, we leave the doors open so we can dry it out. I'm like, oh my gosh. Okay. But then in their mind, that was the best way to do it. And it was, and that's the day I really realized in every single segment of our market, there's a way to shine. I think it is a lot. There's a lot more fog and clouds and smoke in the dry van market. You know, like Andy Steve at Trucking. I use them out of Florida for all my pharmaceuticals. They were awesome. Right. I tried other carriers out of Florida for my pharmaceuticals and it was okay, but nowhere to the level of Andy Steve. Right. And so, and same thing with California, with Gilead, a lot of my pharmaceuticals from Gilead, like there was all these areas where I'd find one or two like golden gems.
That's the key.
It's the key.
Because then the carriers are looking for you. Like they're trying to find Dan Deegan who's got that load, because carriers are looking for that one load every 2 weeks.
Who cares about what they're actually doing and why they do it and how they do it?
You can win a bid on a carrier like that because they've got a very unique set of operating costs and requirement to be back in that area on a regular cadence. That's absolutely the key, because I've often said to brokers, you know, if you're trying to find carriers in a market today and you're struggling, you really want to be looking for carriers, you know, from the town where you're trying to get the load to, right, as opposed to where the load is originating. So
or that has a really good load in the area that you're looking at going, right? Like I go back to Transcend, right? Our niche was electronics. We knew how to run it. We had the infrastructure, we had the security, we had the gated facility, we had everything. We had team drivers that literally did not stop. Like we had the protocols down. You fuel up before you leave, and every one of our triangles, we could fuel up before we leave, and we would not have to fuel till we got back. So, and we planned it like that. Like this was the strategy that we sat down as a management group, and mapped it out, and said, okay, how do we avoid? Because we got like trailers stolen at truck stops, drivers going in, grabbing a coffee, coming out, gone. $2 million of computers gone in literally 45 seconds. Like it was crazy. So it was, you know, so then when you start going through these things and you start having these challenges in this niche market, you start adopting your processes, policies, and your entire system to the security of that. Same thing in the pharmaceutical industry. I was able to go in and work with companies like big pharmaceutical, like giants, because I had the structure as a broker, and I proved the structure to them. I gave them the documentation. I gave them the proof. And I think this is where, like, my opinion on 2025, and I know we're coming, you know, we got a month and a couple of days left in the Q1, right? I think the ability for companies in this first quarter to really establish what that niche is going to be critical this year. Because I do think, like, if you look at the geopolitical challenges in every industry, right? My brother-in-law is in the robotics welding industry. And I was talking to him about all these, and maybe we'll get into this in the next couple of weeks, you know, really see what's really going to happen here. But I was talking to him about all these tariffs and stuff, because we have a lot of customers that are like, we have no idea what's going on. We're not making any big moves because they don't want to lose millions, right? And it's interesting because in speaking with him, he deals in the OEM sector and a lot of the tier one automotive. And he said, Dan, they're not stopping. And I said, because I thought the first thing that would happen is put a halt on, because, you know, automotive, you start having tariffs like that, you bankrupt companies pretty damn quick, because the average crossing of the border is 7 to 9 times for pieces of vehicles, right? And he said, no, he says, they've invested so much money already. He goes, they can't stop. And I start thinking about that, Dean. And it was interesting because yesterday I had this conversation with my team exactly as we're having it right now. I said, and I told them about this tier one automotive. And I said, what we need to do is we need to find companies that are that far along, that need a strategic supplier, that can help them navigate moving forward. Because you know me, I like my team has to be the highest educated team in the market.
Right.
That's like a mandate for me anyways, is how do we get the most knowledge we can in the shortest period of time to help our customers succeed? That's my philosophy.
Right.
And helping customers navigate this market, I think, is going to be the big thing for as a broker to say, okay, how do I help my carriers and my partners and my customers? And how do the three of us become a united team?
Right.
And I really think that's what the next, especially in this uncertain time, right? Like,
Dan, when the whole economy, our economic outlook could change on a tweet.
I know.
These
Isn't
are
that
the most
crazy?
uncertain times we've ever had. And of course, next week, all of this could change, or it could all stay the same. I've never seen a market like this, but there's no question in my mind that a lot of people are doing exactly as you said, hit the pause button, a lot of wait and see. Not news. We've been saying this for weeks. I think there's a lot of people going to wait and see how rhetoric turns into policy. That's going to affect a lot of markets. But whenever you see, flatbed rates behaving seasonally, that tells you that a lot of the capacity that that we're doing all the crazy stuff during the pandemic has exited, particularly in flatbed and I think high-end reefer commodities, not so much in dry van, because when I look at the number of carriers exiting, we're still on track to have about 5,000 carriers leave. Last month, we had about 6,500, so we've still got 5 days of the month to go.
And how many came in last month?
Well, so I was just going to say, we had 5,300 come in last month. So far, we've had 4,700 come in. So we're currently tracking about 1,000 less. So I think we'll end up with less. When you look at the trend line since the middle of last year, we've had fewer and fewer people joining the industry. That's a consistent trend. And we've had, fewer and fewer leaving the industry. So they're kind of heading towards this point where they get to the number of carriers leaving equals the number of carriers joining, and we're not far off that break-even point where the spread between the two is close to zero. We were there briefly about 6 months ago. The last time we were here was October 2022, where we got to a point where capacity leaving was equaling capacity joining in the spot market. So it feels like we're at the back end of this, Dan. Diesel's been up a little bit in the last few weeks, up about 22 cents since before Christmas. But a lot of that's got to do with the Biden regulation changes and the sanctions on Russia before Christmas. So there is a lot of wait and see type attitude going on in the market. But my sense is that the capacity that needed to leave the industry has happened in past tense. Doesn't mean carriers won't be joining, but I think we're in for a period where rates are going to be fairly flat because, even though capacity is leaving and capacity getting tighter in some sectors, there's no demand signal yet that's saying that we've got a market that's going to take off anytime soon.